Close your eyes for a moment and picture the pyramids being built. You see it, don't you? The endless desert stretching toward a horizon that shimmers with heat. Thousands of slaves in tattered cloth, backs bent under the weight of massive stones, whip marks fresh on their shoulders, overseers with cruel eyes standing watch from the shade. The pharaoh himself, draped in gold, surveying his monument from a distance, unmoved by the suffering below. It's a powerful image, vivid, almost cinematic, and it's been inside your head since childhood, planted there by movies, textbooks, documentaries narrated by authoritative voices. That image is wrong, not partially wrong, not missing a few details, fundamentally, completely, almost offensively wrong. Everything you think you know about who built the pyramids, how they lived, why they were there, nearly all of it was invented by Hollywood, not discovered by historians. The chains, the whips, the disposable masses dying in the sand, none of it happened the way you've been shown. And yet the image persists. It's what your teachers taught you. It's what the documentaries from the 70s and 80s repeated without question. It's what massive blockbuster films immortalized on screen. The story was simple. It was dramatic. It fit perfectly into existing narratives about ancient civilizations and the price of human ambition. Nobody questioned it because nobody needed to. But here's what they didn't tell you. In the last 30 years, archaeologists have uncovered something that shouldn't exist if the old story were true. Workers' tombs. Not mass graves. Individual burials with honors. With tools. With beer jars meant for the afterlife. They found villages where these workers lived, evidence of medical care, records of payments and rations. They found proof that the people who built the pyramids weren't slaves at all. And when that discovery became impossible to ignore, when the evidence stacked so high that even the most stubborn scholars had to admit the truth, something strange happened. Most people never heard about it. The old story was already too deeply embedded, too familiar, too easy to keep repeating. So the question becomes unavoidable. If slaves didn't build the pyramids, if everything we were taught was manufactured for drama rather than accuracy, then who actually did? Who were the real people moving those stones? And why would anyone willingly participate in something so brutal? In the early 90s, something happened near the Giza Plateau that should have made headlines everywhere. Archaeologists digging in the shadow of the pyramids found tombs. That might not sound unusual. Ancient Egypt is filled with tombs. But these weren't the elaborate resting places of pharaohs or nobles. These were workers' graves. And they weren't mass burials where bodies had been dumped without ceremony. They were individual tombs, carefully constructed, filled with provisions for the afterlife. Tools were buried alongside the dead, bread, dried fish, and beer. Jars and jars of beer meant to sustain these workers in eternity. If slaves built the pyramids, this discovery made no sense. Slaves don't get honored burials. They don't get provisions for the afterlife. They get mass graves, if they're lucky. Yet here were hundreds of graves, each one suggesting that the person inside mattered, that their work had been recognized, that their contribution to the pyramids earned them something beyond suffering and death. The excavators stood in those tombs and realized they were looking at evidence that contradicted everything the world believed about pyramid construction. And this was just the beginning. Nearby, they uncovered entire villages. Not temporary camps or crude shelters, but organized settlements with bakeries, breweries, sleeping quarters, and what appeared to be medical facilities. The scale was staggering. These villages could have housed tens of thousands of workers. The layout suggested planning, infrastructure, a system designed to sustain a massive labor force over years, even decades. Whoever lived here wasn't disposable. They were fed, housed, and cared for. The evidence kept mounting. Hieroglyphic records mentioned work teams with names, not numbers. They referenced ration distribution, rotation schedules, even what seemed to be compensation systems. Then came the papyri. In the early 2000s, excavators working at a site called Wadi al-Jarf, near the Red Sea, found something extraordinary. Papyrus scrolls, intact, readable. And they weren't religious texts or royal decrees. They were logbooks, daily records kept by workers involved in transporting stones for pyramid construction. The entries were mundane, almost bureaucratic. They noted which teams moved which stones, where they were delivered, how long the journey took. These weren't the writings of slaves. Slaves don't keep administrative records. These were the logs of organized workers operating within a structured system, documenting their labor the way any organized workforce might. The archaeologists who made these discoveries, names like Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, occasionally appeared in reports, knew what they'd found would be controversial. They were dismantling a narrative that had been accepted for centuries. Scholars initially resisted. How could this evidence be reconciled with the established story? Hollywood had slaves. Biblical accounts suggested slaves. Why would tens of thousands of free workers volunteer for such brutal labor? The skepticism was understandable. The old story made sense in a grim, simple way. This new evidence suggested something far more complex. But the findings couldn't be dismissed. The tombs were real. The villages existed. The papyri contained names, dates, details that matched perfectly with other archaeological evidence. Slowly, reluctantly, the academic world began to accept what the evidence had been screaming all along. The pyramids weren't built by slaves. They were built by Egyptian workers, free workers, workers who were fed, organized, honored in death, and apparently motivated by something far more complicated than the threat of a whip. And that's where the mystery deepens. If these people weren't forced, why did they come? What could possibly motivate someone to spend months hauling multi-ton stones across the desert, risking injury and death, enduring conditions that would break most modern humans? The answer isn't simple. It involves religion, economics, social structure, and a way of thinking about life and death that's almost alien to us now. But before we can understand why they came, we need to know who they were. For over a century, historians and archaeologists obsessed over a single question. How did the Egyptians build the pyramids? How did they cut the stones with such precision? How did they move blocks weighing tons across the desert? How did they lift them hundreds of feet into the air without modern machinery? Entire careers were spent calculating angles, testing theories about ramps and levers, debating the logistics of stone transport. The how consumed everything. But there's another question, one that somehow got buried under all that technical analysis. A question so obvious it's strange we didn't ask it sooner. Why? Not why did the pharaohs want pyramids. That part seems clear enough. Monuments to eternity, tombs designed to ensure their journey to the afterlife, physical declarations of divine power. Fine. But why did the workers show up? Why did tens of thousands of individual human beings, free people with families and farms and lives of their own, willingly participate in something so brutal? We know they weren't slaves. The evidence proved that. We know they were fed and housed and given medical care when injured. We know they were honored in death. But we also know the work was backbreaking. We know people were injured. We know some of them died. The skeletons don't lie about the toll this labor took on human bodies. So why did they come? If you ask that question in a modern context, the answers seem simple. Money. They were paid, so they worked. But the economy of ancient Egypt didn't function like ours. Payment in bread and beer and occasional meat isn't the same as a salary that buys freedom and choice. And if it was just about survival, about securing food for a season, why do the records show the same teams returning year after year? Why do the tombs suggest pride, even honor, in the work they did? There's something else happening here, something we're missing because we're asking the question through a modern lens. Ancient Egyptian society didn't operate on the same values that drive us today. Their relationship with work, with community, with religion, with death itself, it was fundamentally different. We live in a world that worships individual choice and personal fulfillment. They lived in a world where community obligation and cosmic order mattered more than individual comfort. We see death as an ending. They saw it as a transition, one that required specific preparations and collective effort. We separate the sacred from the secular. They didn't. For them, building a pyramid wasn't just construction. It was participation in something divine. But even that explanation is too simple. The truth isn't a single answer. It's not just religious obligation, though religion played a role. It's not just economic need, though that mattered too. It's not just national pride or social pressure, or the opportunity for advancement, though evidence suggests all of those factors existed. The truth is a mosaic, a complex web of motivations that varied from worker to worker, village to village, season to season. Some came because they believed it would secure their own afterlife. Some came because their community expected it. Some came because it was the only way to feed their families during the months when the Nile flooded their farmland. Some came because it offered a chance to rise above the station they were born into, and some probably came because everyone else was going, and staying behind felt like a kind of death in itself. Understanding why these workers came means understanding a way of thinking about life, death, purpose, and community that barely exists anymore. It means stepping outside our assumptions about what motivates human beings and entering a world where the lines between obligation and choice, between the individual and the collective, between the living and the dead, were drawn completely differently than they are now. The pyramids aren't just ancient wonders, they're windows. And if you look through them carefully, you start to see minds that operated on logic we've almost entirely forgotten. Over the next hours, we're going to walk through their world, not as tourists observing from a distance, but as closely as possible to how they experienced it. From the moment a worker received the summons to serve, through the brutal daily reality of construction, to the end of their service or their life, we're going to answer why they came. But the answer is going to be stranger than you expect. Every summer, the Nile swallowed the land. It wasn't a disaster. It was expected, necessary, even. The river would swell with waters from distant mountains, overflow its banks, and spread across the valley floor, transforming Egypt's farmland into a vast inland sea. For 3, sometimes 4 months, the fields disappeared beneath the flood. And when the fields disappeared, so did the work. Farmers who'd spent the rest of the year planting, tending, and harvesting suddenly found themselves with nothing to do. No crops to water, no soil to turn, just time. And in ancient Egypt, idle time during the inundation season didn't mean rest. It meant you were available. This is when they came. Not slaves in chains, not professional builders hauled from construction sites across the kingdom. Farmers, men who knew soil and seed and the rhythm of seasons. Men who'd never touched a copper chisel or hauled a stone in their lives. They came from villages scattered across Upper and Lower Egypt, some travelling just a few days, others walking for weeks to reach Giza. They brought their sons, their brothers. Sometimes entire families made the journey together, the men heading to the construction site, the women and children staying behind in temporary settlements nearby. This wasn't voluntary in the way we'd understand it today, but it wasn't slavery either. The pharaonic administration had figured something out. During the months when the Nile made farming impossible, Egypt's workforce sat idle. Feeding them without productive work strained resources. But if that workforce could be redirected, if those idle months could be transformed into labour for state projects, suddenly the flood season became an opportunity rather than a burden. The system had a name, corvée, though the farmers probably didn't think of it in those terms. To them, it was simply what happened when the river rose. You went, you worked. And if the gods were kind, you came back when the waters receded and the planting season began again. The scale of this mobilization is staggering even by modern standards. Archaeologists estimate that during peak construction periods, 20 to 30,000 workers might be on site simultaneously. But these weren't permanent residents. They rotated. Teams would serve there 3 or 4 months, then return home as the Nile dropped and their fields emerged from the mud, ready for planting. New teams would arrive to replace them. This cycle repeated year after year, decade after decade, creating a rhythm that defined entire generations. Grandfathers who'd worked the pyramids told stories to grandsons who'd follow the same dusty roads decades later. Imagine that departure. A farmer standing outside his home, looking back at his wife, his children, wondering if this would be the year he didn't return. The villages would empty out as men gathered in groups for the journey north. They'd walk for days, sometimes weeks, following routes that became highways of human migration every summer. The pyramids would appear on the horizon long before they reached them, growing larger with each day of travel, until the scale became impossible to comprehend. These were men who'd spent their lives measuring success in harvests and seasons, and now they were walking toward monuments designed to last forever. Not all of them came back. The work was brutal. Accidents happened, stones shifted, ropes snapped, heat took its toll. Some bodies were sent home for burial. Others were interred near the pyramids, honoured in death for their service, but still dead, still gone. The families waiting in those distant villages never knew for certain if their men would return until they actually appeared, thinner and scarred, walking the same roads they'd left on months earlier. But here's what's strange. The system worked. For generations it worked. Farmers kept coming. The pyramids kept rising, which means the equation somehow balanced. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, something about this arrangement made sense to the people living it. Maybe it was the food provided during service, better than what many could grow themselves. Maybe it was the religious significance, the belief that participating in the pharaoh's eternal monument earned divine favor. Maybe it was simply that this was how the world worked, and questioning it was as pointless as questioning the flood itself. Still, farmers alone couldn't build pyramids. Hauling stones and mixing mortar is one thing, but cutting blocks with precision, surveying angles, calculating weight distribution that required expertise. Which means there had to be others, permanent workers, specialists, the ones who stayed when the farmers went home. The farmers came and went with the river's rhythm. But there were others, men who didn't leave when the floodwaters receded, men who lived in the shadow of the pyramids year-round, who grew old watching the monuments rise stone by stone, whose entire lives were defined by the work. These weren't common labourers. They were specialists, the permanent workforce, the ones who made pyramid construction possible. Stonemasons, architects, engineers, surveyors, foremen who coordinated teams and kept records, artists who carved hieroglyphs and marked stones. These positions didn't open to just anyone. They were often hereditary, passed from father to son, creating dynasties of expertise that spanned generations. A master mason would train his sons in the craft, teaching them how to read stone, how to identify structural flaws by sound alone, how to calculate angles without the mathematics we rely on today. Knowledge was preserved through lineage, accumulated over lifetimes, refined with each generation. These workers occupied a strange place in Egyptian society. They weren't nobility. They'd never sit in the pharaoh's court or own vast estates. But they weren't common labourers either. They were skilled craftsmen, respected for their knowledge, essential to projects that defined Egypt's power and religious identity. They lived better than farmers, ate better, had access to resources most Egyptians never saw: meat, fish. These were luxury foods, rarely available to common people, but archaeological evidence suggests skilled workers consumed them regularly. Their housing was superior too, purpose-built villages near construction sites with better structures, more space, some degree of comfort in an otherwise harsh environment. The roles themselves were specialized in ways that reveal sophisticated understanding of construction. Master masons didn't just cut stone. They understood geology, could assess quality, knew which blocks could bear weight and which would crack under pressure. Surveyors maintained the pyramid's precise angles using tools that seem primitive to us: plumb bobs, measuring rods, water levels, but achieved accuracy that modern engineers find remarkable. The pyramid's bases are level to within inches across hundreds of feet. That's not accidental. That's expertise applied with obsessive care. Engineers calculated load distribution, designed ramps, determined how to lift multi-ton blocks without modern machinery. They worked without our mathematics, without our materials, yet solved problems that would challenge contemporary builders. And they did it repeatedly, year after year, refining techniques with each pyramid, learning from mistakes, passing knowledge to the next generation of permanent workers who'd continue the tradition. Evidence suggests these workers organized into teams with distinct identities. Hieroglyphic records mention groups with names Friends of Khufu, Drunkards of Menkaura, suggesting not just labor divisions but camaraderie, competition, pride. Teams apparently vied with each other, racing to complete sections, boasting about their accomplishments. This wasn't mindless drudgery. There was culture here, rivalry, humor, even. We know this because they left messages. Graffiti carved into stones that would be sealed inside pyramids forever, never meant to be seen again. Quarry marks identifying which team cut which block. Complaints about rations, jokes, boasts, the kinds of things real people write when they're bored or frustrated or proud. These weren't slaves leaving desperate pleas for rescue. These were workers marking their territory, claiming their contribution to something permanent. Their names are still there, sealed in darkness, written by hands that understood this work mattered. What motivated someone to dedicate an entire life to this? to spend decades, from youth to old age, working on monuments they'd never see completed. The prestige mattered. Being a master mason or foreman carried status, respect, a degree of power over others. The economic stability mattered too. Guaranteed work, steady rations, security most Egyptians didn't have. But there was something else, something harder to quantify: religious significance. These workers weren't just building tombs. They were participating in divine projects, creating pathways for god-kings to reach the afterlife. In a society where religion saturated every aspect of existence, that participation meant something profound. Some foremen were literate, rare, in a world where most people never learned to read or write. They kept records, documented progress, communicated with administrators. This literacy elevated them further, made them essential intermediaries between the physical work and the bureaucratic machinery that sustained it. But even with all this skill, all this expertise, all these permanent workers dedicating their lives to construction, the system still required something more. 20 to 30,000 workers needed to be fed daily, housed, supplied with tools, supervised, rotated on schedules. The logistics alone should have been impossible. Which means there had to be another layer, an invisible architecture of administration holding everything together. The workers built the pyramids, but someone had to build the system that made the workers possible. Picture 30,000 workers. Now imagine feeding them 3 times a day, every single day, for decades. The scale of that challenge alone should have made pyramid construction impossible. And yet it happened. Which means someone figured out how to coordinate one of the most complex logistical operations in ancient history. But when we think about who built the pyramids, we think about the men moving stones. We don't think about the invisible army that made those men capable of moving anything at all. For every worker hauling limestone, there were scribes recording deliveries, tracking attendance, calculating rations. There were administrators managing schedules, ensuring teams rotated properly, resolving disputes when workers claimed unfair treatment. There were bakers working through the night, so bread would be ready at dawn. Brewers, producing thousands of litres of beer daily, because beer wasn't just a drink, it was nutrition, calories, hydration, payment. There were butchers slaughtering animals, cooks preparing meals, doctors treating injuries, toolmakers replacing broken chisels and worn ropes. None of these people ever touched a pyramid stone. Yet without them, the pyramids would never have existed. The papyri found at Wadi al-Jarf reveal the obsessive detail of this administrative system. Daily logs, records of stone deliveries noting which team transported which block, how long the journey took, any problems encountered. Attendance records tracking which workers were present, which were injured, which had been sent home. Ration distributions documented down to individual loaves of bread. Progress reports sent up the chain of command, informing overseers and ultimately royal officials how construction advanced, where delays occurred, what resources were needed. This wasn't casual record-keeping. This was bureaucracy operating at a level of sophistication that shouldn't have been possible without modern tools. The logistical requirements were staggering. Archaeologists studying the workers' villages estimate that feeding the peak workforce required slaughtering 21 cattle and 23 sheep every single day. That's just the meat. Add bread workers consumed roughly 10 loaves each daily, and you're looking at production that required industrial-scale bakeries. Evidence shows these bakeries operated continuously, with dozens of workers and hundreds of bread molds, producing thousands of loaves around the clock. Beer production was equally massive. Workers received roughly a gallon each per day, which meant breweries had to produce tens of thousands of litres daily. This wasn't artisanal brewing. This was factory-scale manufacturing happening 3,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. All of this required supply chains that extended far beyond Giza. Farms dedicated to growing grain exclusively for pyramid workers. Ranches raising cattle and sheep for slaughter. Quarries producing not just pyramid stones but the tools to cut them. Forests, or what passed for forests in Egypt, providing wood for sledges, ramps, and levers. Copper mines supplying the metal for chisels. Each of these operations required its own workforce, its own administration, its own logistics. The pyramids weren't just construction projects. They were economic engines, employing tens of thousands directly and probably hundreds of thousands indirectly through the support systems they demanded. The bureaucratic structure itself was multi-layered. At the bottom, foremen managed individual teams. Above them, overseers coordinated multiple teams. Above them, regional administrators managed entire sectors of the project. At the top, royal officials answered directly to the pharaoh, reporting progress and requesting resources. Scribes existed at every level, documenting everything, creating the paper trail that has allowed archaeologists to reconstruct how this system functioned. Disputes arose constantly, workers claiming they'd been shorted on rations, teams arguing about assignments, individuals accusing foremen of favoritism. Officials had to mediate, enforce rules, maintain order among thousands of men living and working in close quarters under brutal conditions. Religious administrators played a role too. Priests ensured ritual purity, performed ceremonies, maintained the spiritual framework that justified the entire enterprise. For workers who believed they were building a divine monument, religious observance wasn't optional. It was central to the project's meaning. Priests blessed stones, consecrated completed sections, performed rites for workers who died on site. They were part of the organizational machinery, managing the spiritual dimension just as scribes managed the material one. This administrative system was so sophisticated, so carefully structured, that it may have established templates for Egyptian governance that persisted for centuries. The ability to coordinate tens of thousands of people, manage complex supply chains, maintain detailed records, resolve disputes, and sustain operations for decades. These weren't skills that disappeared when pyramids were completed. They became embedded in how Egypt functioned as a state. Without this invisible architecture, the visible pyramids would have been impossible. The workers who moved stones depended entirely on the organizers who moved everything else. And understanding that reveals something crucial. The pyramids weren't just feats of physical labor. They were monuments to organizational genius, to administrative sophistication, to a civilization that figured out how to coordinate human effort on a scale that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. But all of this, the farms, the bakeries, the scribes, the carefully maintained supply chains, only mattered if workers actually showed up. And that required something more than just organization. It required motivation. So how did Egypt get tens of thousands of people to participate? What brought them to Giza, year after year, generation after generation? That question has answers. But they're not the ones you'd expect. The messenger arrived on foot, dusty from days of travel, carrying a leather satchel filled with papyrus scrolls. Word spread through the village before he even reached the headman's house. Everyone knew what those scrolls meant. The flood was still months away, but the summons came early. The pharaoh's pyramid needed workers. And this year, some of those workers would come from here. The village headman would unroll the scrolls in the center of the settlement, reading names aloud while families gathered to learn their fates. The selection wasn't random. Local officials maintained records of which households owed labor service based on land holdings, family size, and previous service. They tried to rotate fairly, avoiding taking too many men from any single village in a given year. Devastate a community by removing all its working-age males, and that community couldn't produce the grain that fed Egypt. The system required balance. But balance didn't make the summons feel less absolute when your name was called. For some, the news brought unexpected excitement. Young men who'd spent entire lives working the same small plots their fathers and grandfathers had worked. Men who'd never travelled beyond neighbouring villages, never seen the capital, never participated in anything larger than a harvest. The pyramids represented something beyond their ordinary existence. Adventure, purpose, a chance to be part of something that mattered beyond the boundaries of their immediate world. They'd heard stories from older men who'd served tales of the massive construction sites, the organised villages, the sheer scale of the project. For these young workers, the summons was an opportunity disguised as obligation. For others, it brought dread. Older men who'd already served their terms, who carried injuries from previous seasons, who wanted nothing more than to tend their farms and grow old surrounded by family. Men with young children who couldn't imagine leaving for months, unsure if they'd return. Men who'd heard different stories, the accidents, the deaths, the workers who left healthy and came back broken. For them, the summons was a shadow falling across everything they'd built. Exemptions existed, but they weren't free. Wealthy farmers could sometimes hire substitutes, paying other men to serve in their place. or they could provide extra grain to the state, buying their way out of physical service through economic contribution. This reveals something textbooks rarely mention: pyramid construction operated within class structures, where wealth provided options that poverty didn't. Common farmers with nothing but their labor had no choice. Wealthier landholders could negotiate. The system bent for those who could afford to bend it. But refusal wasn't really an option, not for most. The consequences ranged from fines to forced service under harsher conditions to social stigma that could follow a family for generations. The summons came with the weight of religious duty behind it. Priests framed pyramid service as sacred obligation. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a god. Building his eternal resting place wasn't merely construction, it was participation in divine work, ensuring the god-king's successful journey to the afterlife and, by extension, maintaining cosmic order. Egypt's prosperity depended on the pharaoh's favor with the gods. Refusing to help build his tomb was refusing to serve Egypt itself. The departures were marked with ceremony. Village priests performed blessings, asking gods to protect the workers and ensure their safe return. Families made offerings at local shrines. Wives gathered supplies, extra sandals, sleeping mats, small amulets for protection. Mothers pressed bread and dried fish into their sons' hands, aware this might be the last time. Children watched fathers prepare to leave, too young to understand fully but old enough to sense the weight of the moment. You had 4 weeks. 4 weeks to prepare your farm for your absence, to teach your brother or eldest son how to manage the work while you were gone, to repair tools and mend fences and do everything that wouldn't get done for the next 3 or 4 months. 4 weeks to say goodbye. Because everyone knew, even if they didn't speak it aloud, that not everyone came back. Some would die at the construction site. Others would return so injured they'd never work their farms the same way again. The summons changed everything. And whether you felt pride or terror, or some complicated mixture of both, when your name appeared on that scroll, you went. The summons compelled. But compulsion alone doesn't build pyramids that stand for millennia. Fear and obligation might get workers to show up, but they don't inspire the kind of effort, the precision, the sustained commitment that pyramid construction demanded. The Egyptians understood this. So they built a system of incentives sophisticated enough that many workers didn't just endure their service, they competed for it. Start with the most basic motivation: food. Workers received daily rations that exceeded what most farmers could produce for themselves. 10 loaves of bread, a gallon of beer, onions, garlic, occasionally meat. This wasn't subsistence. This was abundance by ancient standards. Archaeological analysis of workers' remains shows something remarkable. Many of them were healthier during pyramid service than they were at home. Better nutrition meant stronger bones, fewer deficiencies, bodies that could actually recover from the day's labor rather than slowly breaking down. And meat. This matters more than it sounds. Beef was luxury food in ancient Egypt, reserved mostly for the wealthy and for religious ceremonies. Common farmers might eat meat a few times a year, if that. But workers at the pyramid sites consumed it regularly. Not every day, but often enough that it represented a dramatic improvement over their normal diets. Returning home after months of pyramid service, visibly stronger and healthier than when you left, carried its own kind of prestige. Your neighbors could see the difference. You'd eaten like someone who mattered. Beyond food, the incentives multiplied. Service exempted you from other taxes during your term. That might not sound dramatic, but in a society where taxation could mean surrendering grain your family needed to survive, exemption was significant. For families living close to subsistence, those months of guaranteed food and tax relief could mean the difference between stability and disaster. Then there was mobility. Most farmers were born into their station and died there, but pyramid construction created pathways upward. Exceptional workers, those who showed leadership, intelligence, unusual strength, or skill, could be promoted to foreman positions. Some earned permanent roles, escaping agricultural labor entirely. For ambitious families, sending a son to pyramid service was strategic investment. Distinguish yourself, catch the eye of an official, and doors opened that would otherwise remain closed forever. The spiritual incentive mattered too, perhaps more than anything else. Ancient Egyptians believed the pharaoh's successful journey to the afterlife maintained cosmic order and ensured Egypt's prosperity. Contributing to his eternal monument wasn't just civic duty, It was religious participation that earned merit. Workers genuinely believed that their labor, their sacrifice, would benefit them in the afterlife. This wasn't propaganda forced on them by priests. The evidence suggests real faith. They wanted to participate in something sacred. Competition added another layer. Teams weren't just labor units. They had identities, names, pride. Graffiti found sealed inside pyramids shows teams boasting about their accomplishments, claiming to be the fastest, the strongest, the best. They competed for recognition, for better rations, for the honor of completing the most difficult tasks. This wasn't mindless drudgery. There was culture here. Rivalry that pushed workers beyond what mere obligation would have achieved. The state even invested in keeping workers alive and functional. Evidence of healed fractures shows surgical intervention, broken bones set properly, time given for recovery. Workers who could return home and work their farms again were investments protected. Dead workers were losses. The system recognized this and allocated resources accordingly. None of this erased the brutality. Workers still died, still suffered injuries that ended careers and lives. The heat, the exhaustion, the danger incentives didn't eliminate these realities. But they help explain why the system functioned, why workers kept coming, why some even volunteered for additional service. The Egyptians built a framework where participation made rational sense, where workers could calculate that the benefits, food, status, spiritual merit, opportunity balanced against the risks. Which meant when workers finally arrived at the construction site, they came with complicated motivations. Fear and obligation, yes, but also hope, ambition, faith, and for some, genuine pride. What they found when they got there would test all of it. They left in groups, sometimes dozens from a single village, sometimes just a handful. Men on foot carrying rolled sleeping mats and whatever tools they owned. Men with donkeys loaded with supplies. Men boarding boats that would carry them north along the Nile, the river that had flooded their fields now becoming the highway to their service. They came from everywhere. The delta in the north, where the Nile split into fingers reaching toward the sea. Middle Egypt, where villages clung to the river banks between desert expanses. Upper Egypt, hundreds of miles south, where the journey to Giza could take 2 weeks of continuous travel. This migration happened every year, timed with the agricultural calendar, turning roads and waterways into corridors of human movement. Workers speaking different dialects, practicing customs specific to their regions, carrying gods and traditions from distant temples. For a few months each year, Giza became the most cosmopolitan place in Egypt, a temporary convergence of the entire nation compressed into construction villages and work sites. The journey itself wasn't casual. Way stations dotted the major routes, places where workers could rest, receive food, and continue the next day. Officials checked travel documents, papyrus scrolls proving workers had been legitimately summoned, weren't deserters or criminals trying to disappear into the anonymous workforce. Supply depots provided rations for the journey, ensuring workers arrived at Giza capable of working rather than half-starved from weeks of travel. And the journey served another purpose. Workers travelled in groups under supervision of local officials and foremen who'd made the trip before. Strangers became familiar. Shared meals, shared exhaustion, shared uncertainty about what waited ahead. By the time they reached Giza, these groups had transformed into units, men who knew each other well enough to function as teams. The indoctrination began long before they touched a stone. Then came the moment that made it real. After days or weeks of travel through landscapes that felt familiar, fields and villages and river views, they recognized the pyramids appeared. You'd crest a hill or round a bend, and suddenly there they were, massive beyond comprehension, rising from desert that seemed too empty to support such monuments. Even unfinished, even with wooden ramps scarring their faces like wounds, they dominated everything. Mountains that shouldn't exist, proof that the stories hadn't been exaggerations. Whatever doubts you'd carried, whatever fears whispered during the journey, seeing the pyramids silenced them. This was real. This was what you'd travelled to join. And there was no walking away from something that massive, that permanent, that undeniable. The intake process turned individuals into inventory. Workers reported to scribes who recorded names, villages of origin, physical condition. Assignments followed which team, which housing block, which foreman. First rations were distributed. 10 loaves of bread that had to last until tomorrow's distribution. beer in clay jars, onions. The food you'd been promised, now real in your hands. And the noise. Thousands of workers and animals creating a sound like nothing you'd heard before. Constant, layered, the grinding of stone, shouted orders, braying donkeys. Underneath it all, the smell bread baking continuously, limestone dust hanging in the air, sweat and animal dung and desert heat. The sun reflecting off pale stone until everything blazed white, and your eyes ached from squinting. This was home now. For the next 3 or 4 months, this noise, this smell, this organized chaos. Your sleeping mat in a long barracks with dozens of other men. Your team assigned to tasks you'd learn tomorrow. Your body, which had walked fields and tended crops, now property of the pyramid. That first night, lying on reed mats in darkness, surrounded by strangers from villages you'd never heard of, you could see the pyramids through the barracks doorway, black shapes against stars, silent, waiting. And you understood something that hadn't been real until this moment. You weren't a farmer anymore, you were a builder. And those mountains of stone would take everything you had to give. Maybe more. Darkness. Complete and cold. The kind of cold that shouldn't exist in a desert. The kind that seeps through thin cloth and settles into bones. Then voices, distant at first, growing closer. Foremen moving through the workers' village, calling out in the blackness, their words incomprehensible but their meaning clear. Time to rise. The barracks stirred, not all at once, gradually. The sound of thousands of men waking simultaneously created its own strange music, groans, coughs, the rustle of reed mats, feet finding packed earth floors, bodies moving in darkness, guided by routine rather than sight. This happened every morning, had happened yesterday, would happen tomorrow. The repetition made it mechanical, almost dreamlike. Workers emerged into air, that bit at exposed skin. Desert nights stole all the heat the day had pounded into the ground, leaving behind cold that felt personal, malicious. Men walked to communal washing areas. Ceramic jars filled the previous evening, water that shocked faces into full consciousness. Murmured conversations in darkness. Voices you recognized even if you couldn't see the faces. Your team. The men you'd worked beside until either the season ended or one of you didn't wake up. The darkness mattered. Starting before sunrise meant hours of work in relative cool before the sun transformed the plateau into something hostile. By the time heat became unbearable, half the day's labor would be finished. This was calculation, not cruelty. Though it felt like cruelty when your body screamed for more sleep and the sky offered no hint of dawn. But not everyone woke at the same time. Skilled workers and foremen rose earlier, planning the day's tasks, reviewing yesterday's progress, calculating what needed to happen before the seasonal farmers even opened their eyes. Hierarchy existed even in waking. The permanent workers who'd spent years here moved with purpose, checking tools, consulting with scribes. The temporary labourers from distant villages simply waited for orders, still half asleep, still adjusting to this life that felt nothing like home. Other sounds filled the pre-dawn hour. Somewhere, bakers who'd worked through the night still ground grain, the rhythmic scraping of stone against stone producing flour for bread that needed to be ready when light broke. Animals bleated, confused or terrified, being led towards slaughter to feed thousands of workers who'd burned through yesterday's calories before noon. Tools being sharpened, copper scraped against harder stone, preparing for the day's cutting and shaping and breaking. This awakening wasn't individual, it was coordinated, synchronized. Thousands of men moving through the same routine because the pyramid demanded it. Construction schedules didn't accommodate exhaustion or injury, or the simple human desire to remain unconscious a few hours longer. The work continued regardless, so workers woke regardless. Those who'd been here for weeks moved mechanically. Bodies remembered even when minds didn't. Muscle memory guided them through washing, through receiving tools, through forming teams in darkness. Newer workers still felt the dislocation, the wrongness of waking here instead of home. The strangeness of being surrounded by so many strangers, all preparing for labor that would test limits they didn't know they had. Then the first light, subtle at first, just a lessening of darkness along the eastern horizon. Then more, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to something approaching dawn. And the pyramids emerged from night, massive, unavoidable, blocking stars as they took shape against the lightening sky. Some workers looked at them with pride. Monuments they were building, evidence of their contribution to eternity. Others saw only enemies. Mountains of stone that would demand everything, that would break bodies and claim lives and give nothing back except the promise of food and the distant possibility of religious merit. But pride or dread didn't matter. The pyramids didn't care what workers felt. They simply waited, and the day was beginning. Workers lined up by teams at distribution points scattered throughout the village. The bakers and brewers had been working all night. They always worked all night. Producing enough food for 20,000 men required operations that never stopped. Now, as dawn broke, the results of their labour waited in massive ceramic vessels and piled baskets, bread, beer, onions. The same as yesterday. The same as tomorrow. The bread came first. Dense, coarse flatbread made from emmer wheat, nothing like the soft bread you might imagine. This was fuel, not pleasure. Each worker received 10 loaves, not small loaves. Substantial rounds that weighed heavy in your hands. 10 loaves per man, every single day. The mathematics of that requirement were staggering. Archaeologists who excavated the workers' villages found bakeries unlike anything else in ancient Egypt, massive installations, with dozens of bread molds capable of producing thousands of loaves simultaneously. Industrial-scale food production happening 3,000 years before industrialization. Then the beer. A gallon per worker, though calling it beer misleads. This wasn't the clear, bitter liquid we drink today. This was thick, nutritious, more like liquid bread than beverage. It provided calories, hydration, some level of alcohol that probably helped dull the awareness of what the day ahead demanded. Workers drank standing up, gulping it down because there wasn't time for leisure. Onions. Sometimes garlic. Occasionally dried fish if you were lucky or if your team had distinguished itself recently. The vegetables provided some nutrition, prevented complete dietary collapse, but they didn't make the meal interesting, just functional. This was eating reduced to its most basic purpose, consuming enough calories to remain capable of labor. And there were hierarchies even here. Foremen received slightly better bread, less coarse, sometimes with honey. Skilled workers got access to meat when it was available not every day, but regularly enough that their bodies showed the difference. Temporary farmers, the seasonal workers from distant villages, received the basic rations and nothing more. Even in a system designed to feed everyone, status determined quality. The meal meant different things depending on how long you'd been here. For new workers, it was proof the state would keep its promise. You wouldn't starve. That mattered when you'd left your farm behind with no guarantee of survival. But for workers weeks into their service, the meal represented monotony. The same bread, the same beer, the same onions. Every morning. For months, your tongue forgot other flavors existed. Graffiti found inside pyramids includes complaints about food, workers demanding better rations, threatening slowdowns if quality declined. Even within this authoritarian system, workers found leverage. They could work slower, they could make mistakes, and administrators knew that starving workers or feeding them rotting food would cost more in lost productivity than providing adequate rations. So workers complained. And sometimes, those complaints worked. But the diet had consequences. Skeletal remains show workers suffered from nutritional deficiencies despite adequate calories. The lack of variety meant missing nutrients, deficiencies that weakened bones and teeth, that made recovery from injury slower. The food kept them alive and working. It didn't keep them healthy. 20 minutes, maybe. That's how long workers had to consume their meal. Eat standing up, drink the beer, chew the bread that required effort to swallow. Then it was done. Tools needed collecting, teams needed forming, assignments awaited. The meal was a promise made physical. Participate in this labor, and the state will feed you. For many workers, especially those from poor villages where harvests failed and hunger was familiar, that promise meant something. This bread, as coarse as it was, represented security their farms couldn't guarantee. And so they ate. And then they worked. After the meal, workers gathered in designated areas. Open spaces where foremen and overseers stood conferring with scribes, consulting papyrus records, planning the day's deployment. This wasn't chaos. Every worker had a purpose, a task, a place in the machine. The assignment process revealed the sophistication underneath what could have looked like simple brute labor. Permanent skilled workers knew their assignments before gathering. Stonemasons reported to the quarry or the pyramid faces, where precision cutting was needed. Surveyors checked angles and measurements. Engineers calculated ramp loads and weight distribution. Their expertise was too valuable to waste on variable tasks, so they received consistent assignments that utilized years of accumulated knowledge. For the temporary workers, the farmers pulled from distant villages. Assignment varied day by day. Foremen assessed physical condition with practiced eyes. Older workers, those showing signs of injury or exhaustion, were directed to lighter duties, carrying water to work sites, moving smaller tools, working in shaded areas when possible. The system wasn't kind, but it was pragmatic. Completely breaking a worker meant losing their labor entirely. Better to extract what they could still give. Young, strong workers faced different assignments. The heaviest hauling, the steepest ramps, the stones that required maximum collective effort to move. Their bodies could endure more, so more was demanded. Foremen didn't ask if workers were ready. They simply pointed, called out team numbers, and expected compliance. Teams formed around these assignments. Crews of 10 to 20 men working under a foreman's direct supervision. Multiple crews coordinated into larger teams, with specific goals: move this stone from quarry to staging area, construct this section of ramp, prepare this pyramid face for casing stones. The structure created accountability. If your team failed, everyone knew. If your team succeeded, you shared the recognition. Social bonds mattered here. Teams often consisted of men from the same villages who'd travelled together, who knew each other's families, who'd grown up hearing the same stories. These bonds created mutual obligations stronger than what overseers could impose through punishment. You didn't want to be the one who failed your team, who let down men from your village, who became the story of weakness that would travel home before you did. Competition emerged naturally. Teams didn't want to be slowest, didn't want to be the crew that couldn't complete their assignment. Pride operated alongside fear. The same graffiti that complained about rations also boasted about accomplishments. We moved more stone than the northern crews. Our team completed the west ramp section in 2 days. This internal motivation supplemented external compulsion, driving productivity beyond what threats alone could achieve. Then came the moment assignments transformed into action. Thousands of workers dispersed across the plateau simultaneously. Some headed to the quarry where stone waited to be freed from bedrock. Others moved toward existing stones that needed transport. Teams climbed ramps already constructed, heading toward pyramid faces, where today's blocks would be placed. The relative quiet of morning shattered into noise, hammers striking copper chisels, foremen shouting instructions, the scrape of sledges across sand, animals braying under loads. For new workers, this moment brought clarity they might have preferred to avoid. This was the reality. Every day. For months. The exhaustion, the danger, the monotony of repeating the same brutal tasks until either the season ended or your body did. For experienced workers, it was simply the day beginning again. Bodies knowing what to do. Minds retreating to wherever they went to survive this. The rhythm claiming them. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, 20,000 men were already moving stone, and they wouldn't stop until the sun set. Or they did. The work was brutal. Everyone knew this. Yet it continued for decades, which means something had to give. Either the work broke the workers completely, or workers found ways to accommodate what should have been unendurable. They found ways, not all of them, but enough. Rhythm became survival. Workers developed songs, chants, repetitive patterns that synchronized effort and distracted from pain. When 20 men pulled ropes attached to a sledge carrying a stone, they couldn't pull randomly. They had to move together, strain together, breathe together. So they sang. Simple, rhythmic calls and responses. Nothing complex. Just sound that turned individuals into a single organism capable of moving what no individual could budge. Archaeological evidence supports this. Hieroglyphic records mention work songs. Graffiti references teams known for their chants. The rhythm helped coordinate the physical effort, but it did something else too. It created communal experience that transcended individual suffering. You weren't alone pulling this rope, burning your hands, feeling your back scream. You were part of something larger. The song made that real. The day had micro-rhythms too. Brief rest periods every hour when water carriers moved through work sites, distributing liquid that kept workers conscious in heat that could kill. These breaks weren't kindness, they were calculation. Workers who collapsed from dehydration couldn't work at all. Better to lose a few minutes every hour than lose workers permanently. The pace itself shifted. As sun intensified toward midday, the rhythm slowed subtly. Foremen who understood human limits got more productivity than those who pushed relentlessly. Workers could sustain effort longer if given occasional respite. The smartest overseers rotated teams between heavy and lighter tasks, preventing complete exhaustion while maintaining overall output. Psychologically, workers developed strategies that separated survivors from those who broke. The primary rule: focus only on the immediate task. This stone, this rope pull, this step up the ramp. Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about the week still ahead. Don't think about home or family or anything beyond the next few minutes. Reduce existence to the present moment, and the present moment becomes survivable. Experienced workers mentored new ones, teaching not just technique but survival wisdom. How to conserve energy. How to avoid foreman's attention when exhausted. How to identify which tasks were most dangerous and position yourself to avoid them without appearing to shirk. This knowledge passed informally, whispered advice that could mean the difference between returning home and being buried near the pyramids. Camaraderie emerged from shared suffering, not friendship exactly, something darker, more fundamental. Men who endured this together developed bonds no outsider could understand. They'd seen each other at their worst, weeping from exhaustion, screaming when ropes burned through hands, collapsing in heat. That shared vulnerability created trust deeper than ordinary relationships could produce. Small acts preserved identity. The graffiti scratched into stones, the jokes shared during brief rests, the complaints about foremen. These moments of defiance reminded workers they were still human, still capable of thought and humor despite being reduced to muscle and endurance. But some couldn't survive. Bodies gave out. Heat stroke took workers who'd seemed strong the day before. Injuries that should have been survivable became fatal without proper rest. Exhaustion accumulated until hearts simply stopped. Workers developed informal rituals marking these deaths. Superstitions emerged around certain stones or locations believed unlucky. These weren't official practices. They were spontaneous attempts to create meaning from random tragedy. The rhythm itself, wake, eat, work, rest, eat, work, rest, eat, sleep, repeated day after day, created a trance state. Time blurred. Individual days became indistinguishable. Identity simplified to pure existence. For some, this was breaking. The loss of self, the reduction to nothing but function. For others, it was paradoxically freeing. No decisions, no choices. Just the rhythm, just the next stone. Just survival reduced to its most basic elements. To survive the pyramids, you had to forget you were human. You became rhythm, breath, muscle, nothing more, and for some, nothing less. The quarry was noise incarnate, constant, layered, inescapable. Copper chisels striking limestone in rhythmic percussion that never stopped, thousands of impacts per hour creating a sound that vibrated through bone. Shouts of foremen attempting communication over the din. The sudden crack of stone splitting, sharp and violent like thunder breaking directly overhead. And underneath everything, the rasp of debris being scraped away, the grunt of men lifting, the wheeze of lungs struggling against air thick with limestone dust. Dust coated everything. Workers became ghosts, white powder settling into hair, skin, the folds of cloth, creating a second skin that itched and choked. When you coughed, the substance you expelled was white. When you spit, it came out pale. The dust infiltrated lungs, settled deep where it would never fully leave, creating damage that wouldn't manifest for years, but was accumulating with every breath. The quarries themselves were landscapes of controlled destruction. Canyons carved by human hands into bedrock, stretching hundreds of meters, creating stepped patterns where workers had systematically extracted stone level by level. Archaeological evidence shows this wasn't random excavation. This was planned, organized removal, following the stone's natural structure, minimizing waste while maximizing usable blocks. Master quarrymen dominated this environment. These weren't common laborers. They were specialists who'd spent years learning to read stone the way others read papyrus. They could identify natural fault lines invisible to untrained eyes, could tap stone and hear the internal structure, could predict where cracks would propagate when pressure was applied. Their knowledge determined success or catastrophic failure, blocks splitting cleanly or shattering into useless fragments. The technique itself revealed sophisticated understanding of material properties. Workers used copper tools, not iron, which was rare and precious in Old Kingdom Egypt. Copper is softer than limestone, which seems paradoxical. You can't cut harder material with softer tools, except you can if you understand leverage and persistence. Quarrymen pounded copper chisels against stone repeatedly, gradually carving channels around the desired block. Not fast, not easy. Just relentless repetition until grooves several inches deep outlined the stone's dimensions. Then came the wedges. Wooden implements driven into the channels, positioned at calculated intervals. Workers soaked these wedges with water, sometimes repeatedly over hours. Wood absorbs water, expands, and when confined in stone channels with nowhere to go, that expansion generates tremendous force. Enough force to crack limestone along desired lines, separating multi-ton blocks from bedrock with precision that seems impossible given the simplicity of the tools. But precision didn't mean safety. Stone is treacherous. Unsecured blocks could shift unpredictably, crushing workers who'd positioned themselves wrong. Collapses buried entire crews when workers miscalculated structural integrity. The physical strain of swinging hammers for hours destroyed bodies, incrementally damaged, fingers that wouldn't close properly, wrists that swelled and refused to heal, shoulders that burned with every movement. Skeletal evidence doesn't lie. Quarrymen's remains show degenerative joint disease years earlier than other workers, their spines compressed under repetitive impact. Their hands bore evidence of multiple fractures, some healed, some not. Respiratory damage from dust inhalation left markers archaeologists can still identify millennia later. Hierarchy existed even here. Master quarrymen, who marked cutting lines and directed operations, held privileged positions, respect earned through expertise. Apprentices learned by hauling debris, performing grunt work, watching and absorbing knowledge that couldn't be taught directly. At the bottom, unskilled labourers simply moved what they were told to move, expendable muscle with no specialised knowledge protecting their value. The quarry was where pyramid construction began extracting its human cost. Not with drama or sudden tragedy, though those occurred. With attrition, with incremental destruction of bodies through repetitive strain and toxic exposure. With the grinding realization that this work would mark you permanently, that even if you survived and returned home, you'd carry the quarry in your lungs and joints for whatever remained of your life. And when a block finally freed from bedrock, when the crack propagated perfectly and stone separated cleanly, there was a moment of accomplishment. Brief, fragile, quickly overshadowed by the next realization. Now this multi-ton block had to move, had to be transported across desert to the pyramid. And somehow, that was going to be even worse. The stone lay partially embedded in debris, rough-edged and irregular, weighing roughly 2.5 tons. Freeing it from bedrock had taken hours of coordinated effort. Now came the next problem. This block couldn't move itself, and in its current state, it couldn't be moved efficiently either. Stone preparation teams descended on newly freed blocks with smaller copper tools, chipping away excess material, creating flatter surfaces that would sit properly on sledges. They worked quickly but carefully, reducing weight where possible without compromising structural integrity. Every pound removed now meant slightly less effort during transport, but there was calculation required. Make the stone too large, and moving it became impossible. Make it too small, and you'd wasted effort extracting more blocks than necessary. Skilled workers judged optimal size through experience, balancing extraction efficiency against transport logistics. Then came the challenge of getting sledges underneath, wooden platforms with runners designed to distribute weight and allow sliding across sand. But stones didn't cooperate. They sat heavy and immobile, flush against quarry floors. Workers used leveraged stone ramps, wooden levers, anything that could lift one edge high enough to slide a sledge beneath. The process required precision. If the sledge wasn't centered properly, if weight distribution was wrong, the stone would shift during transport, and shifting stones crushed whatever was in their path. The sledge technology itself was simple but effective. Wooden platforms, nothing complex, just solid construction that could bear enormous weight without collapsing. The runners created a sliding surface that reduced friction compared to dragging stone directly across sand. But even with sledges, friction remained the enemy. Evidence suggests Egyptians discovered that water changed everything. Pour water ahead of the sledge, soak the sand, and suddenly friction decreased dramatically. The wet sand became almost slick, transforming an impossible task into merely brutal. 20 to 30 workers gathered around each loaded sledge, ropes in hand. The ropes attached to the sledge at multiple points, distributing pull force to prevent tipping. A foreman positioned himself where he could see the entire team, calling rhythm. Pull together, or accomplish nothing. Pull uncoordinated, and someone dies. The moment of initial movement was always dangerous. Everyone strained simultaneously, feet digging into sand for purchase, hands burning where rough rope pressed into flesh. At first, nothing. Just maximum effort against immovable resistance. Then, gradually, incrementally, the stone shifted. Friction overcome, weight beginning to slide. Those first meters were treacherous. Stones could tip if pulled wrong, shift unpredictably, crush workers who'd positioned themselves badly. The physical toll started immediately. Rope burned through skin on hands and shoulders where workers bore the load. Feet slipped in loose sand no matter how carefully you braced. Your back screamed. Your legs trembled. And the realization settled in this stone had to travel hundreds of meters before even reaching the main transportation route to the pyramid. Hundreds of meters of maximum collective effort, repeated pull after pull, rest break after rest break, until either the stone reached its destination or workers couldn't continue. Accidents were common. Stones shifted wrong and crushed workers underneath or behind. Ropes frayed under load and snapped, the snapback capable of killing anyone in its path. Workers collapsed from exhaustion during heavy pulls, and if they fell in the wrong place, the stone or the team behind them ended it quickly. But workers found small solutions. Evidence suggests they sometimes constructed temporary wooden tracks for initial movement, creating smoother paths that reduced friction even more than water alone. They learned which routes through the quarry complex were flattest, which avoided obstacles, which gave them advantages that meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The quarry operated as organized chaos. Stones at different stages, simultaneously some being extracted, some being prepared, some making their first movements toward staging areas. The overlapping activities created constant motion, constant noise, constant danger. You couldn't focus only on your stone. You had to remain aware of everything around you, because other teams, other stones, other accidents could kill you just as easily as your own mistakes. Successfully moving a stone to the staging area felt like victory. Brief satisfaction that this particular block had made it this far. But the satisfaction died quickly, replaced by the knowledge that this was just the beginning. The stone still had to reach the pyramid, and that journey was going to be worse. The main limestone quarries sat roughly 1/2 kilometre from the pyramids, close enough to see, far enough to require organised transport. But that was just the nearby stone, the bulk material for pyramid cores. The fine white limestone that would eventually case the pyramids in gleaming surfaces came from Tura quarries across the Nile. And the granite for internal chambers, the massive blocks that would bear the most critical structural loads, travelled from Aswan, over 800 kilometres away. Which means pyramid construction didn't just require building pyramids. It required building the infrastructure that made pyramid building possible. Roads that didn't exist had to be created. Routes had to be established, maintained, defended against the desert's constant attempt to reclaim them. Before the first pyramid stone could move, an entire landscape had to be transformed. The main causeway connecting quarry to construction site was engineering in itself. Workers levelled sand, removed obstacles, created the straightest possible path to minimize transport distance. But creating the path once wasn't enough. Sand shifts, wind buries. The route required constant maintenance. Archaeological evidence suggests dedicated teams whose entire job was keeping causeways clear, smooth, traversable, not glamorous work, not the kind that earned recognition. But without it, everything stopped. For nearby limestone, the solution was brutal simplicity. Sledges pulled by worker teams, the same technology used for initial movement from quarry floors, just sustained over longer distances. 20 to 30 men per stone, pulling in rhythm, stopping for water and rest, then pulling again, hundreds of meters at a time, day after day. But for Tura, limestone and Aswan granite, sledges weren't enough. The distances were too great. the loads too heavy. So the Nile became the highway. During flood season, when water levels rose highest, stones were loaded onto massive barges. The river could travel closer to construction sites when swollen, reducing overland transport distance dramatically. This required its own infrastructure: dockworks, loading ramps, leverage systems sophisticated enough to transfer multi-ton stones from land to water and back without sinking barges or crushing workers. Timing became critical. River transport only worked during inundation, which meant granite and casing stone deliveries had to be scheduled around the flood cycle, coordinated months in advance. Miss the window, and materials sat useless until next season. The logistics of synchronizing quarrying in Aswan with transport during flood season, with construction schedules at Giza, required planning that shouldn't have been possible without modern communications. Yet it worked. Archaeological evidence suggests hundreds of stones moved daily during peak construction, hundreds, which meant continuous traffic along these routes, bottlenecks where multiple sledges converged, delays when stones shifted wrong or ropes broke, the need for traffic management, for overseers coordinating flow, for systems that prevented complete chaos. The transportation routes created their own geography. Workers lived along them, not permanently, but in rotating shifts, maintaining way stations and rest points. Communities formed around these functions, temporary settlements existing solely to support stone movement. The routes weren't empty desert. They were populated corridors, alive with human activity and the grinding sound of progress. And accidents. Stones slipped from sledges and had to be reloaded, sometimes taking hours or entire days. Ropes broke under sustained load. Workers were crushed when stones shifted during transport. The routes claimed lives just as surely as quarries did, just more distributed, less concentrated, easier to overlook in the larger machinery of construction. But workers weren't passive. Evidence suggests deliberate slowdowns, accidents, that delayed transport when teams wanted better rations or rest. The stones themselves became bargaining chips. You couldn't build pyramids without moving stones, and you couldn't move stones without workers willing to pull. That created leverage, slim but real, that workers occasionally exploited. During peak operation, these routes were chaos. Hundreds of sledges, thousands of workers, animals hauling supplies, foremen shouting coordination, dust clouds visible from kilometers away. Noise that never stopped. The desert transformed into a highway system, moving material from distant quarries to a construction site that consumed everything fed into it. The pyramids were just the visible part. Underneath, around, supporting them, an entire infrastructure that transformed landscape, created temporary cities, established trade routes, developed logistics systems that wouldn't be matched for millennia. The monuments couldn't exist without this invisible architecture. But all of this, the quarrying, the preparation, the transportation was preparation. The stones still had to be lifted, had to climb hundreds of feet up pyramid faces, had to be placed with precision that seems impossible given the tools available. That was the final test, and it was the most brutal of all. Gravity never tired, never weakened, never negotiated. It pulled with constant, implacable force on every stone that needed to rise. And the only weapons workers had against it were rope, wood, and human bodies willing to break before stone fell. The challenge was simple to state, impossible to imagine. Later, pyramid tiers required lifting blocks weighing 2.5 tons, some much heavier, hundreds of feet vertically. No wheels. Wheels weren't used in Egyptian construction. No pulleys. Pulleys wouldn't appear in Egypt for centuries. No draft animals strong enough to haul such loads up steep inclines. Just human labor. Ropes. Wooden levers. Ramps that somehow made the impossible merely brutal. Archaeologists debate how the ramps actually functioned. No single system's remains have been definitively proven. The evidence is fragmentary, suggestive, rather than conclusive. Straight ramps, extending from ground level to pyramid faces, would need to be miles long for upper tiers, impractical, requiring more material than the pyramids themselves. Zigzagging ramps wrapping around pyramid sides seem more feasible, but would require constant reconstruction as the structure grew. Internal ramps built into the pyramid structure intrigue some researchers, though evidence remains limited. The truth likely involved combinations, different techniques for different pyramid sections, adaptations as structures grew taller and logistics shifted. Workers solving problems as they encountered them, developing methods through trial and error and accumulated expertise. But whatever the specific ramp configuration, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. Stones on sledges had to be pulled up inclines. Steep inclines, likely 10 to 15 degrees, by teams of workers, 20 to 30 men per standard block, more for heavier stones, pulling in desert heat that turned the ramps into furnaces, feet slipping in sand despite water poured to increase traction, ropes cutting into shoulders until skin broke and bled, breath coming in gasps that never felt adequate, every muscle screaming. And the knowledge, always present, that if the rope broke or the team faltered, the stone would slide backward, crushing anyone in its path. The technique required perfect coordination, workers spaced along ropes at calculated intervals, pulling in rhythm synchronized by foreman's calls or work songs. Individual effort meant nothing. Only collective force could overcome gravity's hold. The group had to function as single organism, straining together, breathing together, moving together. Break the rhythm, and the stone stopped. Or worse, shifted unpredictably. Archaeological evidence hints at ramp structures. Post holes suggesting wooden reinforcement. Compacted material indicating construction routes. Where patterns on pyramid edges, showing where stones scraped during placement. These traces reveal organization, planning, engineering sophistication that contradicts any notion of primitive labor. Workers couldn't sustain maximum effort indefinitely, so teams rotated. Every 15 to 20 minutes, fresh workers replaced exhausted ones without stopping the pull. The stone had to keep moving. Stop. And you'd have to overcome inertia again. Stop. And gravity claimed more advantage. The rotation had to happen seamlessly. Exhausted workers stepping away while fresh ones took their places on the ropes, maintaining tension, maintaining momentum. Position on the rope line determined your fate. Workers at the front faced the most danger. If the stone shifted, if something went catastrophically wrong, they'd be crushed first. Workers at the rear had the most exhausting position. Maximum pulling leverage required. Team assignments rotated to distribute risk and exhaustion. Nobody stayed in the worst positions permanently. Everybody took their turn. When stones finally reached their intended level, there was brief celebration, collective accomplishment, proof that human will could defeat gravity, at least temporarily. Then reality reasserted itself. The return trip down to fetch another stone. The knowledge that this victory meant only that you'd earned the right to do it again. The pyramids contain over 2 million stones. Every single one had to be lifted. The mathematics are staggering. Moving all those stones up those heights required billions of human hours of maximum physical exertion. Billions. Distributed across decades of construction, yes, but concentrated into individual moments of almost superhuman collective effort. Moments repeated day after day, stone after stone, generation after generation. The pyramids weren't built by technology or genius alone. They were built by accumulated suffering and strength. By workers who pulled until ropes cut through to bone, who strained until muscles tore, who kept pulling anyway because stopping meant failure, meant shame, meant the stone sliding backward and crushing everyone behind you. Gravity was the enemy that never tired. And somehow, impossibly, humans won. Barely. The stone had been freed from bedrock, transported across desert, lifted hundreds of feet up ramps. But it wasn't finished. Not yet. Because the real test came now, in the final placement, where brutality gave way to precision. Archaeologists, measuring pyramid blocks, discovered something that shouldn't be possible. In many places, you can't insert a knife blade between stones. Not because of mortar was just filler for microscopic gaps. The stones themselves fit together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. And the pyramid bases are level to within inches across acres of construction. These aren't approximations. They're achievements requiring measurement and placement techniques that seem impossible given the tools available. Master masons performed this work, not seasonal farmers, not temporary laborers. Permanent specialists who'd spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting their craft. They understood stone the way musicians understand instruments, could read its structure, predict its behavior, shape it to requirements that left no margin for error. Their tools were simple: copper saws and chisels for final shaping, dolerite hammers harder than the copper they struck, wooden squares ensuring right angles, plumb bobs checking vertical alignment, measuring rods marked with cubits for dimensional accuracy. Nothing sophisticated by modern standards, but in skilled hands, adequate for miracles. The placement process required patience that contradicted everything about pyramid construction's brutal pace. Stones arriving at their intended level still needed fine-tuning. Masons would examine the space, measure neighboring blocks, mark where edges needed trimming. Workers chipped away excess carefully, checking frequently, removing material that couldn't be replaced if they cut too much. Then came the levering. Wooden beams inserted under stone edges, using fulcrum points to lift and shift incrementally, gaining clearance measured in millimeters, adjusting position fractionally until the stone aligned perfectly with its neighbors. This could take hours, days, for critical placements. Rush it and stones wouldn't fit properly, creating structural weaknesses that would propagate through the entire pyramid. Take too long and construction schedules suffered, delaying everything downstream. Master masons walked this balance through experience, and intuition developed over lifetimes. They knew when good enough was actually good enough, when perfection was necessary, and when close was acceptable. That judgment was worth more than strength, more than endurance, more than any amount of brute labor. Their social status reflected this value. Master masons received higher rations, better housing, respect that common laborers never earned, because their work directly determined whether the pyramid stood or collapsed. Compromise precision, and the entire structure became vulnerable. Get it right, and the monument endured millennia. Evidence of their pride remains sealed inside pyramids. Quarry marks identifying which master cut which stone, graffiti claiming credit for particularly difficult placements. These markings would never be seen once construction finished, yet workers carved them anyway, wanting to claim their role in eternity, even if only the stones themselves would know. The moment of final placement was anticlimactic and profound simultaneously. After all the hauling, the lifting, the adjustments, the stone finally settled into its designated position, fitting so precisely that the gap between it and neighboring blocks was nearly invisible. Mortar filled microscopic irregularities, nothing more. The stone's placement, not the mortar, held everything together. This precision reveals sophisticated mathematical and engineering knowledge. Egyptians understood geometry, could calculate angles without modern tools, maintained consistent measurements across massive scales. The pyramid's faces are oriented to cardinal directions with accuracy that still impresses contemporary engineers. North, south, east, west aligned within fractions of a degree. How they achieved this remains debated, though the leading theory involves astronomical observation, specifically circumpolar stars that never set below the horizon. Mark a circular wall, track star positions as they rise and set, bisect the angle you found true north. Simple conceptually, difficult practically, requiring patience, clear night skies, and understanding of celestial mechanics. While farmer laborers provided muscle, these skilled workers provided precision. Their contribution was as essential as any pharaoh's vision, any administrator's organization. Without this expertise, pyramids would have been piles of stone, impressive for their scale perhaps, but unstable, doomed to collapse under their own weight within years. The precision workers transformed raw material into monuments, and if they failed, everything failed. The pressure was immense, the skill required extraordinary. They could place 2-ton stones with jeweler's precision, and the pyramids stand today because they almost never failed. Almost. Skeletal evidence doesn't lie about what happened when stone won. Workers' graves near the pyramids reveal traumatic injuries at rates far exceeding normal populations. Crushed vertebrae, compound fractures where bones shattered and broke through skin, amputated limbs, skull fractures, the kinds of injuries consistent with heavy construction accidents, in an environment where mistakes meant death. The dangers were multiple and constant. Stones shifted unpredictably during transport, crushing workers underneath or behind them. Ropes frayed under sustained load and snapped, the whiplash fatal to anyone in its path, or the released stone falling onto crews below. Workers lost footing on ramp edges during steep climbs, falling dozens of feet onto rock and debris. Heat exhaustion and dehydration killed in desert sun that showed no mercy to exhausted bodies already pushed beyond reasonable limits. Specific scenarios emerge from archaeological evidence and experimental archaeology. A rope breaking during a steep upward pull, the stone immediately sliding backward, workers in its path having only seconds to scatter or be crushed. A worker losing balance on a ramp edge, arms flailing uselessly as gravity claimed him, the fall ending on unforgiving stone below. A block tipping during final placement, pinning a worker's leg, the choice immediate amputate, or watch him die slowly as the stone's weight destroyed circulation and tissue. But Egyptians practiced emergency medicine. Skeletal remains show healed fractures with evidence of splinting. Successful amputations where the person survived not just days, but years after the injury, bones showing clear healing patterns. Even crude surgery, drilling into skulls to relieve pressure, patients surviving the procedure long enough for bone to begin regenerating. The state recognized the need to preserve workers' lives when possible. Partly from pragmatic labor calculation, trained workers were investments. Partly from the same religious values that honored their burials. Life mattered, even common workers' lives, enough to warrant medical intervention. After an accident, work paused briefly. The injured were removed, the deceased identified. Then work resumed. Construction schedules couldn't accommodate extended mourning. The pyramid demanded continuation regardless of individual tragedy. Bodies were taken to the workers' cemetery. Families in distant villages would be notified months later when survivors returned with news that someone wasn't coming home. For workers who died, their pyramid service ended in the shadow of the monument they'd helped build. But their graves suggest this death carried meaning. Tools buried alongside bodies. Beer jars for the afterlife. Amulets. The positioning and provisions indicating belief that dying while building the pharaoh's tomb earned special status in the afterlife. Their death in service to the god-king carried religious significance that transcended the tragedy. Surviving workers carried psychological weight. Watching colleagues die, while knowing your own turn on dangerous tasks, was inevitable. Created trauma that had no outlet, no acknowledgement, no treatment. You simply continued working. The fear became background noise, constant but necessarily ignored because dwelling on it meant paralysis. Workers developed superstitions and rituals spontaneously. Prayers before dangerous pulls, offerings to gods before ascending ramps. Avoidance of certain stones or locations believed unlucky after accidents occurred there. These weren't official practices sanctioned by priests or administrators. They were desperate attempts to impose order on chaos, to create illusion of control over circumstances that were fundamentally uncontrollable. The total death toll remains unknown. Some estimates suggest hundreds over a pyramid's decades of construction. Others suggest thousands. Evidence is incomplete. Graves don't preserve perfectly. Records, if they existed documenting casualties, haven't survived. The uncertainty is honest. We simply don't know how many workers died building pyramids. But what's undeniable? People died regularly. Their deaths were accepted as inevitable costs of the project, not celebrated, not desired, but anticipated and absorbed into the machine of construction that continued regardless. Workers' graves were positioned deliberately within sight of the pyramids, not unmarked mass burials where bodies were dumped anonymously, individual graves acknowledging these workers' contributions. In death, they remained part of the eternal monument they'd built. This recognition was limited. They weren't buried with pharaohs or nobles, but it was recognition nonetheless. Something almost unprecedented in the ancient world, acknowledgement that common workers had value beyond their labor. They buried workers with tools and beer jars. Provisions for an afterlife earned by dying in service to eternity. Small comfort for those left to finish the pyramid. Archaeologists digging near the Giza pyramids in the late 20th century uncovered something unexpected. Not more tombs, not treasure, settlements, extensive remains of what could only be described as cities. Barracks stretching for hundreds of meters, industrial-scale bakeries, breweries, copper workshops, administrative buildings, even evidence suggesting a central street system organizing the chaos. These weren't temporary camps. These were functioning urban environments built in desert that should have supported nothing. At peak construction, these workers' cities housed 20 to 30,000 people. That made them among the largest settlements in Egypt at the time. Not permanent cities like Memphis or Thebes, but temporary concentrations of humanity that rivaled anything else in the kingdom. For months each year, More people lived and worked at Giza than almost anywhere else in the known world. The layout revealed sophisticated organization, different sectors for different worker types and status levels. Permanent skilled workers lived in better quarters closer to construction sites, smaller barracks, more space per person, proximity that reflected their value. Temporary seasonal workers occupied larger communal structures farther from the pyramids, packed efficiently, housed adequately, but without comfort. Administrative and religious officials maintained separate areas, preserving social hierarchies even in temporary settlements. The desert city replicated Egypt's class structure in compressed form. Infrastructure requirements were staggering. Water management systems bringing liquid to thousands of workers in an environment where water didn't naturally exist in sufficient quantities. Waste disposal, preventing disease in densely populated quarters where sanitation failures could kill as efficiently as construction accidents. Security maintaining order among tens of thousands of men from different regions, different backgrounds, different loyalties, all pressed together in spaces where tensions could explode into violence. Specialization appeared everywhere. Entire sections devoted to tool production and repair. Copper workers forging and reshaping chisels, woodworkers constructing sledges and levers, medical facilities treating injured workers, performing surgery, setting bones, attempting to save lives that construction tried to claim. Storage areas for food quantities that boggled comprehension: grain, dried fish, beer, all stockpiled against the constant demand of feeding armies of labourers. The sensory experience must have been overwhelming. Bread baking perpetually, the smell never absent because production never stopped. Noise of thousands of men living in close quarters, conversations, arguments, laughter, grief, all layered into constant human sound. Dust coating everything, limestone powder mixing with sand, creating a pale film that settled on skin, clothes, food, turning everything the colour of the pyramids themselves. Heat trapped between buildings during the day, the structures themselves radiating stored warmth. Then the shock of desert nights, temperature plummeting, bodies that had been sweltering now shivering under thin blankets on reed mats. Social dynamics were complex. Workers from the Delta, Middle Egypt, Upper Egypt, different regions bringing different dialects, different customs, different gods. Forced proximity created friction. Arguments over space, over rations, over perceived slights. But it also created fusion, practices mixing, stories shared. The settlements became Egypt in miniature, a cross-section of the entire nation compressed into temporary structures, creating culture that existed nowhere else. Entertainment survived even here. Game pieces discovered suggest workers played Senet during rest periods, the ancient board game providing mental escape from physical exhaustion. Beer production far exceeding medical needs indicates social drinking, gatherings where workers could forget briefly what tomorrow demanded. Graffiti and informal artwork show maintained creative expression, humans refusing to be reduced entirely to muscle and endurance. Religious presence pervaded everything. Temples and shrines where workers could pray, seeking divine protection or offering thanks for survival. Priesthoods performing rituals, maintaining connection to the project's sacred purpose, reminding workers this wasn't just construction, but participation in cosmic order. The settlements evolved over construction periods. As pyramids grew, cities expanded, infrastructure improved based on lessons learned, better water distribution, more efficient food production, improved housing. The temporary became semi-permanent, some structures standing for decades. Yet here's the paradox. These were some of the most well-organized, well-supplied settlements in Egypt, but they were entirely dependent on pyramid projects. When construction ended, these cities vanished. Workers dispersed. Buildings were abandoned. Sand reclaimed everything. Archaeologists discovered them only because they looked beneath meters of accumulated desert. In the desert, where nothing should survive, they built cities, maintained them for decades, then let them disappear completely, leaving only traces for future generations to puzzle over. These settlements weren't just housing. They were complete societies with hierarchies, rules, economies, cultures, entire ways of life that existed parallel to regular Egyptian society, but separate from it. Understanding pyramid construction requires understanding these temporary cities, because this is where workers actually lived, where pyramid construction was more than just labor, where it became life itself. Work ran from dawn until dusk. Breaks for meals and water punctuated the day, but they weren't rest, just pauses in labour that resumed immediately after, which meant workers had only evening hours that were truly their own. 4 hours, maybe, between the end of work and the beginning of sleep. 4 hours to recover from what the day had taken and prepare for what tomorrow would demand. Late afternoon, thousands of workers streamed back from construction sites, covered in limestone dust, moving with the slow gait of complete exhaustion. Some fell directly onto sleeping mats without eating, bodies shutting down before minds could protest. Others forced themselves through the motions, washing dust from faces, consuming rations, tending to injuries that had accumulated through the day. Recovery was its own challenge. Workers needed to consume enough calories to replace what they'd burned, needed to treat injuries before they worsened. Rope burns that could become infected, muscle strains that could tear completely, dehydration that could progress to organ failure. Evidence suggests designated healers worked these evening hours, setting broken bones, bandaging wounds, treating heat stroke. Papyrus medical texts from the period describe treatments for fractures, burns, and construction-related injuries. The knowledge was there. Whether it was applied effectively to common workers remains uncertain. Social bonds intensified during these hours. Workers gathered in teams, especially those from the same villages who'd travelled together, who maintained connections to home through shared memory. When travellers arrived from their regions, news spread quickly whose harvest had failed, who'd married, who'd died. These updates were lifelines to identities that pyramid service tried to erase. Cultural preservation happened in small acts, stories from home told and retold, regional songs sung quietly, religious rituals practiced specific to home temples. These moments prevented complete dissolution of individual identity into mass worker consciousness. You weren't just a body moving stones. You were from somewhere. You belonged to people who remembered you. That mattered more than any ration or shelter. But friction existed too. Informal hierarchies and conflicts emerged. Disputes over sleeping spaces, who got spots near walls that offered some privacy, who slept in the centre of barracks exposed to everything. Arguments over perceived unfairness in ration distribution. Occasional fights that required overseer intervention. Thousands of exhausted, stressed men living in close quarters created constant potential for violence. The psychological toll accumulated. Isolation from families, monotony of routine, constant physical pain, fear of injury or death that never quite receded. Some workers broke mentally. Papyri mention workers who became unable to continue, who were sent home early. Recognition that humans have psychological limits, even if administrators preferred to ignore them. Others found escape in alcohol. Beer wasn't just nutrition, it was numbing agent. Drink enough, and the mind retreated temporarily from reality. Tomorrow's dread became less sharp. Yesterday's trauma faded slightly. The present moment became tolerable. But here was the paradox. Rest hours were necessary for survival, yet they were also when workers had time to think, to remember, to question why they were here. During work, the body's demands silenced the mind. You couldn't philosophize while pulling ropes or dodging stones. But during rest, the mind roared back. Some workers preferred the mind-numbing exhaustion of labour to the tortuous consciousness of rest. Small acts of resistance preserved identity, graffiti scratched into walls, informal gambling that overseers tolerated because forbidding it would create more problems than allowing it. Jokes and pranks that maintained morale reminded workers they were humans, capable of humour despite circumstances designed to reduce them to function. Evidence suggests romantic and sexual relationships formed. Workers lived in all-male barracks for months. Humans seek connection under any circumstances. Some found it with each other. The evidence acknowledges this, without dwelling on details that archaeology can't fully reconstruct. Workers marked time obsessively, carving notches into wood or stone, counting days until rotation home, performing rituals on days they believed were lucky, celebrating informal milestones when teams completed difficult tasks. These small markers broke the endless repetition into manageable segments. This week, this month, this season, then home. Eventually, exhaustion claimed everyone. Workers lying on reed mats in long barracks, the sounds of thousands of men snoring, coughing, talking in sleep. Some called out names, wives, children, gods. Some wept quietly, some lay silent, staring into darkness. Sleep wasn't rest in any meaningful sense. It was the body's forced shutdown, a biological requirement. Dreams often replayed the day's labor, endless stone pulling, ropes cutting into hands, foremen shouting. Or worse, dreams of home that made waking unbearable. The pre-dawn darkness would come too soon, and the cycle would begin again. They had 4 hours between dusk and dawn that were their own, but exhaustion stole 3, and fear claimed the 4th. 20 to 30,000 workers couldn't organize themselves. The scale alone demanded constant supervision, coordination, discipline. Someone had to assign tasks, maintain schedules, enforce productivity standards. Someone had to stand between the workers and the higher authorities who'd never touched stone but demanded results. That role fell to foremen, and accepting it meant becoming something complicated. Most foremen were experienced former workers, promoted based on competence and loyalty. They'd pulled the ropes, hauled the stones, survived enough seasons to understand exactly what they were demanding of others. That knowledge made them effective. It also made them complicit. They weren't distant administrators issuing orders from comfortable offices. They stood beside the workers, watching exhaustion and fear and pain, knowing they'd caused it, that their authority depended on continuing to cause it. Foremen carried staffs marking their position, simple wooden implements that meant everything: power to assign tasks, distribute rest periods, decide who worked the most dangerous positions, and power to punish. Evidence suggests punishments ranged from reduced rations to beatings to assignment to tasks known to be lethal. The staff wasn't just symbol, it was weapon. The psychological complexity of foremanship was brutal in its own way. Maintain team productivity or lose your position, but push too hard and workers rebelled. Work slowdowns. Accidents that delayed progress. In extreme cases, violence. Foremen had to balance fear with motivation, punishment with encouragement, operating in the narrow space between tyranny and weakness. Those who found that balance kept their positions. Those who didn't were sent back to the ropes themselves. Above the foremen sat higher administrators. Scribes documenting daily progress, calculating resource needs, reporting up chains of command. Engineers planning ramp construction and stone placement sequences. Priests ensuring ritual purity, maintaining the project's religious significance. The hierarchy had layers: common workers, team foremen, regional overseers, chief administrators, ultimately royal architects, answering directly to the pharaoh. Each level created social distance. Upper tiers ate better, lived better, faced less danger. That hierarchy bred resentment. Workers who'd labored for years watched younger, less experienced men promoted through connections or political favor rather than merit. Papyri contain complaints about unfair supervision, corrupt officials extorting bribes for easier assignments, foremen playing favorites with workers from their home regions while punishing others arbitrarily. Confrontations happened. Workers protesting rations or conditions, refusing to work until demands were addressed. Overseers had to negotiate or threaten, calculating which approach would restore order faster. They weren't all powerful. Brutalize workers completely, and you risked rebellion that no amount of staff wielding could suppress. So they operated within constraints, finding the maximum exploitation workers would tolerate. For some, foreman positions were career opportunities, stepping stones to better roles in Egyptian bureaucracy, escape from manual labor permanently. This created incentives for ambition, also for corruption. Foremen extracting bribes from workers desperate for safer assignments, easier tasks, any advantage that might mean surviving to go home. The moral complexity was inescapable. Overseers weren't simply villains. Many were doing necessary jobs in difficult circumstances. Without supervision, the project would have collapsed into chaos. Yet their role required enforcing suffering on others, watching men break and knowing you'd contributed to breaking them. That psychological weight followed foremen into whatever rest they found. Workers' views of overseers varied. Some foremen earned respect through fairness and competence, enforced standards but didn't exceed them unnecessarily, distributed dangerous tasks equitably, protected their teams from higher administrators' unreasonable demands. These foremen were valued, sometimes even trusted. Others were hated. And in rare cases, evidence suggests violent retaliation against particularly brutal overseers. Men who disappeared, accidents that weren't quite accidental. While common workers could potentially return home after their service, many overseers remained years or permanently. Their identities fused completely with the pyramid project. Their status, their livelihood, their sense of self, all dependent on construction continuing and succeeding. This created a supervisory class, psychologically invested in the project beyond what workers experienced. They'd chosen this, accepted the staff, accepted what accepting it meant. They were workers who'd been given a staff and told to make other workers suffer. The ones who refused were sent back to the ropes. The ones who accepted carried different weight, not stones, guilt. Responsibility. The knowledge that productivity standards they enforced were measured in human bodies breaking, and they enforced them anyway, because the alternative was joining the broken. Skeletal remains tell stories that workers couldn't speak while alive. Archaeologists examining bones from workers' cemeteries near pyramids discovered patterns of damage that paint a picture more brutal than any ancient text recorded. These weren't just traumatic injuries from accidents. These were systematic breakdowns of human bodies through repetitive stress, chronic overuse, damage that accumulated silently until it became irreversible. Spines showed compression fractures, vertebrae crushed gradually under the constant strain of hauling, lifting, pulling. Not from single catastrophic events, but from thousands of repetitions, each pull compressing the spine incrementally until bone could no longer maintain its structure. Young men, skeletal analysis, shows some were in their 20s, with spinal damage typically seen in people decades older. Their bodies aged prematurely, years added with each season of service. Joint degeneration appeared everywhere, shoulders, knees, hips, ankles, all showing arthritis patterns consistent with repetitive heavy labor. The kind of wear that normally takes lifetimes to develop, compressed into years. Workers' joints literally wore away, cartilage destroyed, bone grinding against bone with every movement. The pain must have been constant, inescapable. And it didn't end when service ended. This damage was permanent. Hands told their own stories. Fingers broken and healed incorrectly, creating permanent deformities. Wrist bones showing stress fractures that had calcified improperly. Evidence of repetitive strain injuries that modern laborers recognize: carpal tunnel syndrome, tendinitis, damage from gripping ropes and swinging hammers hour after hour, day after day. Some remains showed fingers that had partially fused, bones growing together after repeated trauma, limiting mobility forever. Muscle attachment points on bones revealed where tissues had torn away from their anchors. The body's connection between muscle and bone can only withstand so much force before it fails. Workers exceeded those limits regularly. When muscle tears from bone, it sometimes reattaches, sometimes it doesn't. Either way, full strength never returns. Workers carried these limitations for whatever remained of their lives. Rib fractures were common, caused by falls, by stones shifting unexpectedly, by exhaustion-induced accidents. Many showed evidence of healing, but ribs that heal wrong restrict breathing permanently. Workers who returned home likely struggled with respiratory capacity, diminished by injuries sustained in service. Every breath, a reminder of what they'd sacrificed. Foot bones revealed chronic stress fractures. Walking miles daily while hauling equipment, standing for hours during stone placement. The constant impact on feet that never fully rested. Some fractures healed. Others didn't, creating permanent structural weaknesses that made even normal walking painful for the rest of their lives. The evidence suggests workers knew this was happening. They felt their bodies breaking down, felt joints grinding, felt backs spasming, felt hands that couldn't grip as firmly as they once had. And they continued anyway, because stopping meant losing rations, facing punishment, abandoning teams that depended on them. Because the alternative to working injured was being sent home without completing their service, bringing shame rather than honor. Pyramid construction didn't just extract labor during the months of service, it extracted permanent physical capacity. Workers who served in their 20s carried the damage into their 40s and 50s, if they lived that long. Their productive years were shortened, their ability to work their farms diminished. Some became burdens on families that had sacrificed to send them in the first place. The pyramids didn't just take years from workers' lives, they took their bodies piece by piece. Men who left villages healthy and strong returned decades older than when they departed, bent, limping, hands that shook, backs that couldn't straighten, and this was considered acceptable cost, expected cost, the price of participating in something eternal. The bones don't lie about what pyramid construction demanded. They document systematic destruction of human bodies in service to monuments that would outlast the civilizations that built them. Workers' bodies broke so that stone structures could endure. The exchange seems grotesque now, but thousands of workers made it willingly, or at least without sufficient power to refuse. Their broken bodies are the foundations the pyramids stand on, invisible, buried, but absolutely essential. For decades, archaeologists focused on the pyramids themselves. The monuments were visible, obvious, impossible to ignore. But in the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds, researchers began looking at what surrounded the pyramids, and they found ghosts, not metaphorical ones. Physical traces of settlements that had housed tens of thousands but had been deliberately abandoned, covered by sand, erased so completely that for millennia no one knew they'd existed. The workers' villages near Giza revealed themselves gradually. First, anomalies in ground surveys, then careful excavation exposing walls, foundations, streets laid out in organized patterns. The scale kept expanding as digging continued. What initially seemed like small camps turned out to be extensive urban environments, barracks stretching hundreds of meters, industrial facilities, administrative buildings, evidence of infrastructure that rivaled anything in permanent Egyptian cities. These weren't crude shelters thrown together for temporary housing. They were planned communities with sophisticated layout, different zones for different purposes and different classes of workers. Housing quality varied dramatically based on status. Permanent skilled workers lived in smaller structures with more space per person, better ventilation, proximity to amenities. Temporary seasonal workers occupied large communal barracks, efficient but cramped, designed to pack maximum bodies into minimum space. The industrial zones revealed the support systems pyramid construction required. Bakeries with dozens of bread molds operating continuously. Breweries producing thousands of litres daily. Copper workshops where tools were forged, repaired, recycled when they broke. Storage facilities for grain, dried fish, equipment. Medical facilities where injured workers received treatment. Administrative buildings where scribes kept the records that have allowed archaeologists to reconstruct how these settlements functioned. Religious structures appeared throughout the settlements. Small shrines where workers could make offerings, larger temples where priests performed ceremonies. The religious dimension wasn't separate from daily life, it permeated everything, reminding workers constantly that this labor served divine purpose. Evidence of social life emerged too. Game pieces suggesting workers played senet during rest periods, dice for gambling, artwork scratched into walls. These traces reveal humans maintaining culture despite circumstances designed to reduce them to pure function. They told stories, played games, created art, maintained the things that made them human, rather than just bodies moving stones. The settlements evolved over time. Early construction phases show simpler structures, less organization. Later phases reveal improvements based on accumulated experience, better water distribution systems, more efficient food production, housing designs that provided marginally more comfort. The temporary became semi-permanent as construction stretched across decades. But here's what's most striking. When pyramid construction ended, these settlements were abandoned completely. Workers dispersed, buildings emptied. And rather than being repurposed or maintained, the sites were left to the desert. Sand buried them. Wind eroded them. By the time Greek and Roman tourists visited Egypt centuries later, these workers' cities had vanished so thoroughly that no memory of them remained in local knowledge. Which raises questions. Why erase evidence of the workforce that built the pyramids? Why let these sophisticated settlements disappear? The answers involve what Egypt wanted remembered about pyramid construction versus what actually happened. The pharaoh's monuments endured as intended. But the human cost, the massive apparatus required to make those monuments possible that was allowed to fade into obscurity. The archaeology of these sites isn't just discovering what existed, it's recovering what was deliberately forgotten. The settlements weren't just dormitories and work sites. They were functioning communities where workers lived complete lives despite the brutality defining their presence. Evidence suggests that over time, some settlements developed social complexity that went beyond simple labor organization. Families appeared, not officially sanctioned initially, but inevitable. Some permanent workers brought wives and children. Archaeological evidence shows smaller structures that appear to be family housing rather than barracks. Children's toys have been found, small graves containing infant remains. This wasn't supposed to be a place for families, but humans created families anyway. The presence of children transforms our understanding of these settlements. They weren't just temporary work camps. For some residents, these were homes in the fullest sense. Children grew up in the shadow of the pyramids, playing in streets where their fathers worked, learning trades that would define their own futures. Some second-generation workers never knew any other life. They were born into pyramid construction, lived their entire existence serving the monuments. Women's presence, though limited, left traces. Textile production evidence suggests women wove cloth. Food preparation at scale required additional labor beyond what male workers provided. Some women may have accompanied husbands or sons, finding roles within the support infrastructure. Their lives remain largely invisible in the archaeological record, but their absence from that record doesn't mean they weren't there. Social hierarchies extended beyond work roles into daily life. Permanent residents developed neighborhood identities. Disputes over territory, over resources, over status, created conflicts requiring mediation. Evidence suggests informal justice systems emerged, respected elders who resolved conflicts before they required official intervention. These weren't just collections of workers. They were societies with their own governance structures, however unofficial. Trade happened. Workers received rations, but evidence suggests informal economies developed where goods and services were exchanged. Someone skilled at mending tools could trade repairs for extra food. Someone who could read might write letters for illiterate workers wanting to send messages home. Bartering systems emerged organically, creating economic complexity the official administration didn't control or perhaps even recognize. Cultural fusion happened too. Workers from different regions brought different traditions, different gods, different practices. Proximity forced accommodation. Delta workers learned songs from Upper Egypt. Middle Egyptian cooking techniques spread. Religious practices blended. The settlements became cultural laboratories where Egypt's regional diversity compressed into hybrid forms that existed nowhere else. Entertainment took various forms. Beyond the games already mentioned, evidence suggests storytelling traditions emerged. Workers shared tales from home, created new stories about the pyramids themselves, developed folklore specific to these temporary cities. Some stories probably traveled back to workers' home villages, spreading narratives about pyramid construction that competed with official versions. Resistance culture developed too. Graffiti wasn't just marking territory, it was communication, sometimes mocking overseers, sometimes commemorating achievements, sometimes simply asserting identity against forces trying to erase it. Workers developed coded language, subtle signs of defiance that administrators couldn't easily punish because they couldn't prove intentional resistance. Mental health, though not conceptualized in modern terms, was clearly an issue. Evidence suggests some workers broke psychologically. The papyri mention workers whose hearts had left them, ancient Egyptian description of what we might call severe depression or PTSD. These workers were sometimes sent home, sometimes cared for within the settlements. Their inability to work recognized as something beyond simple laziness or cowardice. These settlements were ecosystems, complete environments where humans adapted to circumstances that should have been unlivable. They created community where none was intended, built social structures where only labor organization was planned, maintained humanity in conditions designed to reduce them to tools. The archaeological evidence reveals resilience more impressive than the pyramids themselves, humans refusing to be broken completely, finding ways to live even in environments built for dying. History remembers pharaohs, archaeologists study monuments, but the vast majority of people involved in pyramid construction left no individual trace, no names recorded in stone, no tombs with identifying inscriptions. They were the forgotten majority workers whose labor made everything possible but whose identities vanished completely. Thousands of seasonal workers passed through these settlements across decades of construction. Most served their terms and returned home to resume farming, their pyramid service becoming stories told to grandchildren but leaving no permanent record. They were the invisible foundation of Egyptian achievement, essential but unacknowledged. Consider the supply chain workers who never touched pyramid stones. Farmers growing grain specifically for worker rations, herders raising cattle for slaughter, fishermen providing protein, brewers, bakers, butchers, all supporting the workforce. Their labour was as necessary as stone hauling, but they're even more invisible in historical record. No monuments honour their contribution. The children growing up in these settlements left no trace either. How many were born here? How many died before reaching adulthood? What happened to them when construction ended and settlements dispersed? These questions have no answers. They existed in a liminal space not part of official Egypt, not truly separate from it, their lives unrecorded and unremembered. Women's roles remain almost completely obscured. Some accompanied male relatives, some worked in support roles, some formed relationships with workers. But their experiences are largely absent from both ancient records and modern archaeology. They supported the system that built pyramids, yet history has no space for them. The injured who survived but couldn't work anymore represent another forgotten category. Workers whose bodies broke partway through their service, who were sent home damaged but alive. What happened to them? Did their villages welcome them back or resent them as burdens? Did they receive any support, or were they abandoned to manage disability alone? The records are silent. Even among permanent workers, most left no individual mark. The skilled masons, the surveyors, the engineers, we know these roles existed, but we don't know who filled them. A few names survive in graffiti or papyri, but thousands more are lost forever. Their expertise built monuments that endured millennia, but their identities didn't survive their own lifetimes. This erasure wasn't accidental. Egyptian record-keeping focused on royalty, nobility, high officials. Common workers weren't considered worth documenting individually. Their collective labour mattered only insofar as it served royal projects. As individuals, they were replaceable, forgettable, ultimately disposable. Modern archaeology fights this erasure by studying what remains: bones revealing age and injury patterns, tools showing wear from specific tasks, settlement layouts revealing daily life patterns. Each discovery recovers tiny pieces of lives deliberately left unrecorded. But even dedicated archaeological work can't fully restore what was never preserved. The forgotten majority built everything we see when we look at pyramids. Every stone they placed represents human effort, human sacrifice, human lives lived in service to monuments that would outlast their civilization. They deserve memory. They deserve recognition. They deserve acknowledgement that pyramids weren't gifts from gods or achievements of genius alone. They were products of countless forgotten humans, whose names we'll never know, but whose labour remains visible in every stone. The pyramids stand as monuments to pharaohs, but they're also monuments to anonymity, to the masses whose work was essential but whose identities were expendable. The forgotten majority. Without them, the pyramids would still be architectural drawings. With them, the pyramids became eternal, yet eternity remembered the pharaohs and forgot the workers. That injustice is part of what the pyramids mean. When pyramid construction ended, workers didn't simply return to normal life. They carried pyramid experience with them, physically, psychologically, socially. Their reintegration into villages they'd left months or years earlier was complicated in ways ancient records rarely acknowledge. Physical damage made resumed farming difficult or impossible for many. Men who'd left in their 20s returned with bodies aged beyond their years, backs that couldn't bend properly for planting, hands that couldn't grip tools firmly, joints that screamed with every movement. Some managed to work through the pain, others became burdens on families that had counted on their labour. Psychological scars ran deeper and less visibly. What we'd now recognise as trauma nightmares, replaying accidents, inability to tolerate confined spaces, sudden rage at perceived injustice. Ancient Egypt had no framework for understanding or treating these conditions. Workers either adapted or broke further, with little support beyond what families could provide. Social reintegration presented its own challenges. Workers returned with experiences villagers couldn't comprehend. The scale of pyramid construction, the organisation, the brutality, these were outside normal Egyptian experience. Workers struggled to convey what they'd endured, often giving up and keeping silent, creating isolation that compounded other difficulties. Some workers never returned at all. Not just those who died during service, but those who stayed. Permanent positions offered security that farming couldn't match. Some workers brought families to settlements, establishing lives centered on pyramid construction. When one pyramid finished, they moved to the next project, becoming professional construction workers whose identities fused completely with the work. For villages, the return of workers marked seasonal rhythms as reliable as the Nile's flood. But it also meant absorbing damaged men, redistributing labor to compensate for those who couldn't work as before, integrating stories and experiences that challenged comfortable narratives about serving the pharaoh. The economic impact of pyramid construction extended far beyond the workers themselves. Entire regions oriented their agricultural production toward feeding pyramid workforces. Trade routes developed around supplying construction sites. When projects ended, these economic structures collapsed, forcing communities to adapt to loss of what had become essential income sources. Culturally, pyramid construction's legacy was complex. It demonstrated Egypt's organizational capacity, its ability to coordinate massive projects requiring tens of thousands of workers. This became part of Egyptian identity, proof of civilization's superiority. But it also revealed the human cost of that achievement, though this aspect was downplayed in official narratives. Religious interpretations evolved. Initially, pyramid work was framed as sacred duty earning divine favor. Over time, as costs became undeniable, the religious justification weakened. Later, Egyptian dynasties built smaller pyramids or abandoned the form entirely, suggesting changing attitudes about whether such monuments justified their human price. Some workers gained status from their service. Having participated in building a royal monument carried prestige in some communities. Former workers became village elders, their pyramid experience lending authority. Others found their service meant nothing. They'd sacrificed years for monuments they'd never see again, receiving no lasting benefit beyond survival. The administrative systems developed for pyramid construction influenced Egyptian governance for centuries. The organizational techniques, record-keeping methods, logistics management, these became embedded in how Egypt functioned as a state. Pyramid construction was a laboratory for bureaucratic innovation that extended far beyond the projects themselves. But individual workers were forgotten. As generations passed, specific memories faded. Names disappeared, details blurred. What remained were the monuments themselves and official narratives about divine pharaohs and their eternal resting places. The workers who made it possible became invisible, their contributions erased from the story Egypt told itself. What came after pyramid construction, for most workers, was return to ordinary life made harder by extraordinary sacrifice. They'd built eternity but gained only pain, damage, and memories they couldn't share. The pyramids endured. The workers who built them disappeared into anonymity. That asymmetry, permanent monuments, forgotten builders, defines pyramid construction's legacy more than any architectural achievement. The silence around pyramid workers wasn't accidental. It was constructed deliberately, layer by layer, until the truth became inaccessible even to those who wanted to find it. Official Egyptian records focused obsessively on pharaohs. Royal inscriptions celebrated kings' divine nature, their military victories, their building projects. But they rarely mentioned the humans who actually built those projects. When workers appeared in official texts at all, they were mentioned collectively, abstractions rather than individuals. Workers were gathered or stones were raised, passive constructions that erased human agency and cost. This erasure served purposes. Acknowledging the human cost of pyramid construction complicated narratives about divine kingship. If pyramids required brutal exploitation of tens of thousands of workers, what did that say about Pharaoh's divine mandate? Better to suggest pyramids arose through royal will and divine favor, minimizing or eliminating mention of the suffering required. Later civilizations inherited and reinforced these silences. Greek historians visiting Egypt, centuries after pyramid construction, encountered monuments but found little accessible information about how they'd been built. Local knowledge had fragmented. Oral traditions had evolved. The Greeks filled gaps with speculation, some accurate, much not. The idea that slaves built the pyramids probably originated in this period, though it had no basis in available evidence. Biblical narratives further distorted understanding. The Book of Exodus mentions Hebrew slaves in Egypt, though not pyramid construction specifically. But these stories merged in popular imagination, creating the persistent myth that slaves built the pyramids, a narrative that conveniently fit existing preconceptions about ancient civilizations and slave labor. European colonialism brought new layers of misunderstanding. 19th century archaeologists approached Egypt with assumptions shaped by their own cultural contexts. Many couldn't conceive that ancient, non-European civilizations possessed organizational sophistication. So they interpreted evidence through frameworks that minimized Egyptian achievement while exoticizing it. Pyramids became mysterious monuments built through lost knowledge rather than documented engineering and massive coordinated labor. Hollywood cemented these distortions. Films needed drama, villains, clear moral narratives. Slaves in chains under whips provided visual shorthand, audiences understood immediately. Accuracy mattered less than storytelling convenience. By the time accurate information became widely available, the false narratives had become cultural touchstones, replicated endlessly, believed reflexively. Educational systems perpetuated myths through textbooks that prioritized simplicity over accuracy. Teaching the complexity of pyramid construction, the corvée system, the seasonal workforce, the incentive structures, the sophisticated logistics required nuance that curricula often couldn't accommodate. So students learned simplified versions that erased workers' experiences entirely, or distorted them beyond recognition. Even as archaeology uncovered evidence contradicting established narratives, public consciousness changed slowly. The discoveries of workers' tombs, the excavation of workers' villages, the translation of papyri documenting construction logistics, these findings made headlines briefly, but didn't displace decades of accumulated misinformation. The false narratives were more dramatic, more emotionally satisfying, easier to remember and repeat. The silence around pyramid workers also reflected broader patterns of historical erasure. History traditionally focused on elites, kings, generals, priests, wealthy merchants. Common people appeared only as masses, undifferentiated crowds whose individual experiences didn't merit documentation. This bias meant workers building civilization's greatest monuments remained invisible, while the pharaohs who commissioned those monuments were recorded in exhaustive detail. Modern nationalism sometimes resists accurate accounting of pyramid construction's human cost. Egypt takes pride in pyramids as national symbols. Acknowledging that they were built through systems requiring massive human sacrifice complicates patriotic narratives. Better to celebrate the achievement while minimizing the cost, maintaining monuments as sources of national pride without confronting what they represent about power, exploitation, and the price of eternity. Breaking this silence requires active effort. Archaeologists excavating workers' sites, anthropologists analyzing skeletal remains, historians translating papyri, their work gradually recovers what was buried deliberately. But recovery is incomplete and contested. Every new discovery challenges established narratives, creating resistance from those invested in existing stories. The legacy of silence isn't just about what we don't know. It's about what we weren't supposed to know, what was hidden deliberately, what silence served by erasing workers' experiences from pyramid construction's story. Breaking that silence means confronting uncomfortable truths about how civilizations are built and who pays the price for monuments that endure. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid today, and you're surrounded by silence. Tourists snap photos, guides recite facts. But the stones themselves say nothing about the hands that placed them, the bodies that broke moving them, the lives consumed building them. Yet if you know how to look, the stones remember everything. Every block carries traces, chisel marks from master masons, wear patterns from sledges that transported them, weathering that reveals which stones were placed first and which came later. These marks are archaeological text, readable by those with expertise. They document technique, timeline, the evolution of construction methods across decades. Some stones still bear graffiti team names, worker marks, occasional complaints or boasts, scratched into surfaces that would be sealed away forever. These inscriptions are acts of defiance against anonymity. Workers who knew they'd be forgotten carved their names anyway, claiming their role in eternity even if only the darkness would witness. The precision of stone placement remembers the master craftsman who refused to accept approximation. Blocks fitting together so tightly that millennia haven't created gaps. This isn't luck or divine intervention. This is human expertise applied with obsessive care. Every perfect fit represents hours of adjustment, masters who understood that their reputations depended on precision that would outlast their civilization. The sheer scale remembers the organizational genius required. Over 2 million stones, each weighing tons, all moved, lifted, placed across decades of continuous construction. Modern engineers studying pyramids don't marvel just at the structures themselves, but at the logistics that made them possible. The stones remember coordination that shouldn't have been achievable with available technology. The pyramid's alignment remembers astronomical knowledge. Faces oriented to cardinal directions with accuracy that requires celestial observation. The stones themselves don't point, they were pointed by humans who understood how to read stars, how to translate celestial mechanics into earthly measurements. That knowledge is encoded in every precisely placed block. But the stones also remember what wasn't supposed to be remembered. The workers' villages buried nearby, excavated only recently, reveal what official narratives excluded. The tombs positioned within sight of pyramids acknowledge workers who died building them. The skeletal evidence of injury and trauma documents costs that weren't supposed to matter. The stones remember because they can't forget. Unlike human memory, which fades and distorts, stone preserves. Archaeologists excavating pyramid sites are reading memory written in limestone and granite, recovering stories deliberately erased from papyrus and official inscriptions. What the stones remember ultimately contradicts what we were taught. They remember that pyramids weren't gifts from gods or achievements of divine pharaohs alone. They remember thousands of humans, named and unnamed, honored and forgotten, survivors and casualties whose collective effort transformed architectural ambition into physical reality. They remember that building eternity required destroying bodies, that monuments enduring millennia were purchased with lives measured in decades, that the pyramid's perfection was achieved through human imperfection, trial and error, mistakes corrected, workers who died learning what couldn't be done so survivors could learn what could. The stones stand as monuments to pharaohs because that was their designed purpose. But they also stand as monuments to every worker whose hands touched them, whose sweat soaked into them, whose blood occasionally stained them. Intentionally or not, the pyramids remember the forgotten majority. The evidence is literally built into their structure, waiting for those willing to look beyond surface magnificence to acknowledge the human cost underneath. What the stones remember is everything we tried to forget. And now, finally, we're learning to read what they've been saying all along. The pyramids aren't just ancient wonders. They're archives of human sacrifice, testaments to what civilizations demand and what workers pay. The stones remember. And now, we do too.